In the chaotic world of South Park, few characters command both fascination and revulsion quite like Eric Theodore Cartman. Born into dysfunction and shaped by neglect, his journey spans from innocent childhood mischief to calculated psychopathy, eventual redemption, and ultimate tragedy. This is the complete story of a boy whose desperate hunger for power and acceptance would lead him down paths of unimaginable darkness, only to discover that some wounds never truly heal. His tale serves as both cautionary fable and heartbreaking reminder that even monsters are made, not born. The seeds of Eric Cartman's darkness were planted long before he understood their significance, taking root in the fertile ground of a childhood marked by abandonment, dysfunction, and the absence of moral guidance. Even in kindergarten, young Eric displayed an unsettling combination of charisma and cruelty that would define his character for decades to come. His very first recorded act of true malevolence occurred during what should have been innocent playtime, when he convinced his classmate, Trent Boyett, to start a fire with the promise that they could simply urinate on the flames to extinguish them. The plan went catastrophically wrong when the fire spread beyond their control, ultimately paralyzing their teacher, Miss Choxendick, in a tragic accident that would haunt the classroom forever. Rather than accept responsibility for his role in orchestrating the disaster, young Cartman displayed a chilling capacity for deception and manipulation. When police investigators arrived to question the children about the incident, Eric calmly and convincingly shifted all blame onto the innocent Trent Boyett, weaving a narrative that painted his fellow student as the sole architect of the catastrophe. This early demonstration of Cartman's willingness to sacrifice others to protect himself established a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. The ease with which he lied to authority figures, the calculated nature of his deception, and his complete lack of remorse for destroying another child's future revealed psychological traits that went far beyond normal childhood misbehavior. Trent Boyett would spend years in juvenile detention for a crime that was fundamentally Eric's conception, while Cartman walked free to continue his psychological development without consequence. The dysfunction that enabled such behavior stemmed directly from Eric's home environment, where his mother, Leanne Cartman, had created a household devoid of structure, accountability, or moral guidance. Throughout the early seasons of his life, it became increasingly apparent that Leanne's approach to parenting consisted primarily of indulgence and avoidance rather than discipline or education. Her promiscuous lifestyle had made her a subject of gossip throughout South Park, with her romantic entanglements becoming so numerous and public that they overshadowed any attempt at providing stable maternal influence. The mystery surrounding Eric's paternity became a defining element of his early psychological development, as rumors circulated about which of South Park's many male residents might be his biological father. This uncertainty created a profound sense of instability in the young boy's identity formation, leaving him without a clear understanding of his place in the world or his genetic inheritance. The absence of a father figure meant that Eric lacked masculine role models who might have provided discipline, structure, or examples of healthy masculinity. Instead, he was left to construct his own understanding of power dynamics and social hierarchies based on observation and experimentation. His mother's inability to set boundaries or enforce consequences taught him that authority could be manipulated and that rules were merely suggestions rather than absolute requirements. This lesson would prove catastrophic as Eric began testing the limits of what he could accomplish through manipulation, deception, and emotional exploitation. The early signs of Eric's developing sociopathy manifested in his interactions with classmates, where he demonstrated an uncanny ability to identify psychological vulnerabilities and exploit them for his own amusement. His treatment of his supposed friends, Stan, Kyle, and Kenny, revealed a transactional approach to relationships, where loyalty and affection were tools to be leveraged rather than genuine emotions to be shared. Even as a young child, Eric showed remarkable skill at reading social situations and positioning himself advantageously within group dynamics. His conflicts with Kyle Broflovsky proved particularly revealing, as they exposed both Eric's capacity for sustained hatred and his deep-seated insecurities about his own identity. The intensity of his antagonism toward Kyle suggested psychological projections that went beyond simple childhood rivalry, hinting at internal conflicts that Eric himself did not yet understand. These early confrontations established patterns of behavior that would escalate dramatically as Eric aged and gained access to more sophisticated methods of psychological warfare. The educational environment at South Park Elementary proved woefully inadequate for addressing Eric's behavioral problems, as teachers and administrators consistently failed to recognize the severity of his psychological disturbance. Their inability to intervene effectively during these crucial developmental years allowed Eric's antisocial tendencies to flourish unchecked, creating a feedback loop where successful manipulation reinforced his belief that others existed primarily to serve his needs. Perhaps most troubling was Eric's early demonstration of his ability to compartmentalize his actions and emotions, showing genuine affection for his stuffed animals and toys, while simultaneously displaying callous indifference toward human suffering. This capacity for emotional detachment would later enable him to commit acts of extraordinary cruelty without experiencing the guilt or remorse that might have served as natural deterrents to escalating behavior. The foundation for Eric's future as a master manipulator was laid through countless small victories, where he successfully avoided consequences for his actions, gradually building confidence in his ability to control narratives and shape others' perceptions of reality. Each successful deception reinforced his belief that intelligence and cunning were more valuable than honesty or empathy, setting the stage for increasingly ambitious schemes that would eventually consume not only his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. As Eric's childhood progressed, the gap between his public persona and private nature continued to widen, with his developing skills in emotional manipulation, allowing him to present different faces to different audiences, depending on what each situation required. This early mastery of social camouflage would prove instrumental in his later ability to infiltrate religious organizations, political movements, and business ventures with devastating effectiveness. The tragic irony of Eric's early development was that his obvious intelligence and charisma, properly channeled, might have made him a force for tremendous good in the world. Instead, the combination of environmental neglect, genetic predisposition, and early traumatic experiences created a perfect storm of psychological dysfunction that would ultimately destroy everything he touched, including his own capacity for genuine happiness and human connection. The revelation that would fundamentally shatter Eric Cartman's understanding of his own identity came not through gentle discovery, but through the shocking announcement that his mother, Leanne, was actually his father, a biological impossibility that nonetheless became accepted truth in his young mind. This unprecedented situation arose from what the town believed to be legitimate medical testing, though the results defied all conventional understanding of human reproduction and basic biology. The announcement came during a period when Eric's desperate need to understand his origins had reached fever pitch, making him particularly vulnerable to accepting even the most outlandish explanations. Dr. Mephisto's revelation that Mrs. Cartman was Eric's father created an immediate psychological crisis that would reverberate through every aspect of the boy's developing sense of self. The impossibility of the situation mattered less to Eric than the fact that it provided an answer to the question that had haunted him since he first understood that other children had fathers, while he did not. Rather than questioning the scientific validity of such a claim, Eric's mind latched onto this explanation with desperate relief, finally having something concrete to fill the void where paternal identity should have existed. The psychological impact of believing his mother to be his father created a profound disruption in Eric's understanding of gender roles, family structures, and his own place within both. Traditional concepts of masculinity and femininity became scrambled in his developing psyche, contributing to an already unstable foundation for identity formation. The confusion extended beyond mere biological understanding to encompass deeper questions about authority, protection, and the nature of familial bonds that most children take for granted. This bizarre family revelation coincided with Eric's growing awareness that his household operated according to rules fundamentally different from those governing his classmates' home. While other children could reference their fathers when discussing family structures or seeking masculine role models, Eric was forced to reconcile the cognitive dissonance between his mother's feminine presentation and her supposed biological role as his father. This internal conflict manifested in increasingly erratic behavior as he struggled to process information that challenged his basic understanding of reality. The absence of a traditional father figure had already created gaps in Eric's social and emotional development, but the false revelation about his mother being his father filled those gaps with distorted information that would prove even more damaging than simple absence. Rather than learning healthy models of masculinity through observation and interaction, Eric was left to construct his own understanding based on flawed premises and impossible biological relationships. This foundation of confusion would influence his future relationships with authority figures, romantic interests, and his own sense of masculine identity. Leanne Cartman's failure to correct this misconception or provide alternative explanations revealed the depth of dysfunction within their household, where even fundamental truths about family relationships could be distorted without consequence. Her passive acceptance of her son's confusion demonstrated a pattern of emotional neglect that extended far beyond simple permissiveness into active enabling of psychological damage. The mother, who should have provided stability and clarity, instead became another source of confusion and uncertainty in Eric's already chaotic internal landscape. The impact of this false paternity revelation became apparent in Eric's increasingly volatile emotional responses to situations involving family relationships or masculine authority. His short temper, which had always been problematic, now carried additional psychological weight as he struggled to understand his own gender identity and family position. The rage that would later become his defining characteristic began to intensify during this period, fueled by the cognitive dissonance between his lived experience and his supposed biological reality. Eric's relationship with his classmates became even more strained as he attempted to navigate social situations while carrying the burden of his impossible family secret. The shame and confusion he felt about his mother being his father created additional barriers to forming genuine friendships, as he could never fully participate in conversations about families without confronting his own psychological turmoil. This isolation pushed him further toward manipulative behaviors as alternative means of social connection and control. The false father revelation also contributed to Eric's developing pattern of creating alternative narratives when reality proved too difficult to accept. Rather than questioning obvious impossibilities, he demonstrated a remarkable capacity for accepting contradictory information when it served his emotional needs. This psychological flexibility would later enable him to maintain multiple conflicting belief systems simultaneously, switching between them as circumstances required, without experiencing the cognitive dissonance that would cripple most people. During this period, Eric's anger began manifesting in more directed and personal attacks against his classmates, particularly those who reminded him of his own insecurities about family and identity. His confrontation with Token, where he threatened violence over being called fat, represented not just wounded pride, but the explosive release of deeper psychological pressures that had been building since the father revelation. The incident that led to his hate crime charges stemmed directly from his inability to process the complex emotions surrounding his family situation and personal identity. The hate crime charges and subsequent legal proceedings exposed Eric to the juvenile justice system for the first time, providing him with insights into how institutions could be manipulated and how victim narratives could be constructed to serve personal interests. His experience with lawyers, social workers, and juvenile court officers taught him valuable lessons about presenting different versions of himself to different audiences, skills that would prove instrumental in his later criminal enterprises. The psychological trauma of believing his mother to be his father created a fundamental mistrust of biological and social relationships that would influence every future interaction. Eric learned to view family bonds as arbitrary constructions that could be redefined according to personal needs rather than biological realities or emotional connections. This cynical understanding of relationships prepared him for a lifetime of viewing others primarily as tools to be manipulated rather than individuals deserving of respect and consideration. The period following the father revelation marked the beginning of Eric's transition from a troubled child to a genuinely dangerous individual, as the psychological damage from accepting impossible family relationships combined with existing environmental factors to create increasingly antisocial behaviors. His capacity for violence, previously limited to verbal attacks and minor physical altercations, began expanding toward more sophisticated forms of psychological warfare that would eventually encompass murder, cannibalism, and systematic psychological torture. Perhaps most tragically, the false father revelation robbed Eric of the opportunity to develop genuine curiosity about his actual biological origins, creating a psychological dead end that prevented him from pursuing healthier forms of identity formation. Rather than continuing to search for real answers about his paternity, he accepted the impossible explanation and built his understanding of himself around fundamentally flawed information. This acceptance of obvious falsehood as truth established a pattern of reality distortion that would characterize his entire approach to life, relationships, and personal responsibility. The transformation of Eric Cartman from troubled child to genuine psychopath began with what seemed like a relatively minor incident involving his classmate, Token Black, but the psychological implications of this confrontation would prove far more significant than anyone could have anticipated. The altercation arose from Token's casual use of the word fat to describe Eric, a comment that, under normal circumstances, might have resulted in typical playground banter or perhaps a brief scuffle between the boys. However, Eric's reaction revealed the extent to which his psychological instability had progressed. As he responded to this perceived insult with threats of extreme violence that went far beyond proportional response, the rock that Eric threatened to use as a weapon against Token represented more than simple childhood aggression, embodying instead a calculated willingness to inflict serious bodily harm over a verbal slight. His promise to smack you in the head with this rock carried genuine menace that his classmates and teachers recognized as qualitatively different from normal childhood threats. The specificity of his threat, combined with his obvious emotional investment in carrying it out, demonstrated that Eric had crossed a psychological threshold where violence was no longer a last resort, but a preferred method of conflict resolution. When Eric actually struck Token with the rock, the incident was immediately classified as a hate crime due to the racial dynamics involved, though the true motivation stemmed more from Eric's desperate need to maintain psychological dominance than from any coherent racial ideology. The hate crime designation carried legal consequences that would expose Eric to the juvenile justice system for the first time, providing him with an education in institutional manipulation that would prove invaluable in his future criminal enterprises. His experience with lawyers, social workers, and court proceedings taught him how legal narratives could be constructed and how victim status could be leveraged for personal advantage. The journey to Alamosa Maximum Security Juvenile Hall marked Eric's first extended separation from his enabling home environment and his first exposure to institutionalized violence and hierarchy. The facility housed juvenile offenders whose crimes ranged from petty theft to serious violent felonies, creating a social ecosystem where survival depended on the ability to project strength and maintain respect through intimidation or alliance building. For most children, such an environment would prove traumatic and potentially rehabilitative. But for Eric, it became a laboratory for studying human nature at its most brutal and calculating. Within the juvenile facility, Eric encountered older and more experienced criminals who recognized his intelligence and manipulative abilities, viewing him as either a potential asset or a threat to be eliminated. His survival strategy involved careful observation of power dynamics and the systematic study of how influence was gained and maintained within the confined social structure, rather than being intimidated by the violence and cruelty around him. Eric found himself fascinated by the efficiency with which stronger inmates controlled weaker ones through carefully calibrated applications of fear and reward. The education Eric received during his incarceration went far beyond anything available in traditional academic settings, as he learned to read micro-expressions, identify psychological vulnerabilities, and construct elaborate deceptions that could be maintained under intense scrutiny. His cellmates and fellow inmates unknowingly provided him with advanced training in psychological manipulation, teaching him techniques for exploiting human weaknesses that would later enable him to orchestrate schemes of unprecedented complexity and cruelty. Perhaps most significantly, Eric's time in juvenile detention introduced him to the concept of long-term planning and delayed gratification in the service of revenge. The institutional environment was filled with inmates who had spent months or years planning elaborate schemes to settle scores with rivals, enemies, or the system itself. These conversations planted seeds in Eric's mind about the possibility of engineering revenge scenarios that could unfold over extended periods, allowing for maximum psychological impact and minimal risk of detection or consequences. The release from Alamosa marked not Eric's rehabilitation, but rather his graduation to a new level of psychological sophistication and criminal potential. His return to South Park Elementary brought him into contact with Scott Tenorman, an older student whose casual scam involving fake pubic hair would trigger the most elaborate and horrific revenge plot in the town's history. The initial transaction seemed innocuous enough, with Scott selling Eric what he claimed were his own pubic hairs for $10, exploiting Eric's desperation to appear mature and sexually developed. The discovery that he had been duped by Scott's fake pubic hair scam struck Eric not merely as a financial loss, but as a profound humiliation that threatened his carefully constructed self-image as someone too clever to be fooled by others. His immediate demand for a refund was met with Scott's dismissive mockery, a response that transformed what might have been a minor embarrassment into a declaration of psychological war. Scott's casual cruelty in refusing to return the money, while simultaneously mocking Eric's intelligence, created the perfect storm of wounded pride and burning resentment that would fuel Eric's most diabolical scheme. The elaborate revenge plot that Eric constructed against Scott Tenorman demonstrated a level of strategic thinking and psychological manipulation that would have been impressive if it had not been so utterly horrific in its execution. Rather than pursuing immediate retaliation, Eric spent weeks studying Scott's psychological profile, identifying his emotional vulnerabilities, and constructing a scenario that would deliver maximum trauma through the systematic destruction of everything Scott valued most. The plan required extraordinary patience, careful timing, and the ability to maintain multiple deceptions simultaneously while appearing to be the victim rather than the architect of the unfolding tragedy. Eric's manipulation of Farmer Denkins represented a masterclass in exploiting adult authority figures for criminal purposes, as he convinced the farmer that Scott's parents were trespassing on his property with intent to steal his beloved pony. The careful construction of this narrative required Eric to study local property laws, understand Denkins' psychological triggers regarding his animals, and time the confrontation to ensure maximum lethality while maintaining plausible deniability about his own involvement in orchestrating the encounter. The murder of Scott's parents through Eric's manipulation achieved multiple psychological objectives simultaneously, eliminating Scott's primary sources of emotional support while providing Eric with the raw materials for the most psychologically devastating aspect of his revenge plot. The decision to grind the bodies into chili represented not merely the disposal of evidence, but the transformation of Scott's greatest loss into the instrument of his ultimate humiliation. The cannibalistic element of forcing Scott to consume his own parents elevated the revenge from simple murder to a form of psychological torture that would leave permanent trauma. The chili cook-off that served as the venue for Eric's ultimate revelation demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of public humiliation and social dynamics as he constructed a scenario where Scott's emotional breakdown would occur in front of an audience specifically chosen to maximize his shame and isolation. The presence of Scott's favorite band, Radiohead, added an additional layer of humiliation as their rejection of Scott in his moment of greatest vulnerability reinforced Eric's message that even Scott's heroes found him pathetic and unworthy of sympathy or support. The aftermath of the Scott Tenorman incident marked Eric's complete psychological transformation from troubled child to accomplished psychopath, as he demonstrated not only the capacity for extreme cruelty, but also the emotional detachment necessary to derive genuine pleasure from another person's ultimate suffering. His satisfaction with the outcome revealed that he had crossed a psychological point of no return, where causing pain to others had become not merely a means to an end, but a source of deep personal fulfillment that would drive his future behavior. The lack of consequences for Eric's orchestration of the Tenorman murders reinforced his belief that intelligence and careful planning could enable him to commit any crime without facing justice, a lesson that would inform increasingly ambitious schemes throughout his adolescence and young adulthood. The successful completion of such an elaborate revenge plot at such a young age established Eric as one of the most dangerous individuals in South Park's history, possessing both the intellectual capacity to conceive complex criminal enterprises and the psychological ruthlessness necessary to execute them without hesitation or remorse. The unexpected windfall that would temporarily transform Eric Cartman's life arrived in the form of his grandmother's death and the subsequent reading of her will, which revealed that she had left her entire life savings of $1 million to her beloved grandson. This massive inheritance came at a crucial moment in Eric's psychological development, providing him with unprecedented financial resources. Just as his capacity for grandiose schemes and manipulative enterprises had reached new heights following his successful revenge against Scott to Norman, the timing of this inheritance could not have been more dangerous, as it gave Eric the means to pursue his most ambitious fantasies of power and control without the natural limitations that poverty might have imposed on his destructive impulses. Eric's immediate reaction to receiving such an enormous sum revealed both his complete lack of understanding about financial responsibility and his fundamental inability to delay gratification in service of long-term planning. Rather than investing the money wisely or using it to secure his future, Eric's mind immediately fixated on the most extravagant and self-indulgent use possible for his newfound wealth. The decision to purchase an entire amusement park represented not merely childish wish fulfillment, but a grandiose expression of his deepest psychological needs for absolute control and social dominance. The creation of Cartman Land fulfilled Eric's ultimate fantasy of possessing something that others desperately wanted, while simultaneously being able to deny them access to it. The theme park became a physical manifestation of his psychological need to be the center of attention, while maintaining complete authority over who could share in his good fortune. By establishing a strict policy that absolutely no one else would be allowed to enter his private amusement park, Eric created the perfect vehicle for expressing his contempt for the rest of humanity, while indulging his own desires without interference or judgment from others. The psychological satisfaction Eric derived from Cartman Land stemmed not from the actual enjoyment of the rides and attractions, but from the knowledge that his ownership represented the ultimate expression of childhood privilege and power. Every moment he spent alone in his private paradise was enhanced by his awareness that thousands of other children were being denied the same experience solely because of his arbitrary decision to exclude them. This dynamic fed directly into his narcissistic need to feel superior to others, providing constant validation of his special status and unique importance. The ironic success of Cartman Land as a marketing phenomenon demonstrated Eric's intuitive understanding of human psychology and desire, even when that understanding was applied unconsciously and in service of purely selfish goals. His strict exclusion policy created exactly the kind of artificial scarcity that drives consumer demand to irrational heights, transforming his private playground into the most coveted destination in South Park, simply because it was unavailable. The psychological principle that people want most, what they cannot, have worked perfectly in Eric's favor, generating enormous publicity and interest without any deliberate marketing effort on his part. The media attention surrounding Cartman Land revealed Eric's natural talent for manipulating public narratives and generating sympathy for his position, skills that would serve him well in future schemes involving religious manipulation and political movements. Television news reports portrayed him as an enterprising young businessman who had created something special and unique, rather than a spoiled child who was using inherited wealth to indulge his antisocial tendencies. This positive media coverage fed Eric's growing sense of himself as someone destined for greatness and public recognition. The financial success that began flowing from Cartman Land's popularity caught Eric completely off guard, as he had never intended to create a profitable business venture, but had instead focused solely on personal gratification and social exclusion. The revelation that other businesses were copying his exclusivity model and that he could potentially earn substantial revenue from his theme park introduced him to concepts of intellectual property, market dynamics, and business strategy that would influence his later entrepreneurial schemes. However, his fundamental inability to understand delayed gratification and long-term planning prevented him from capitalizing on these lessons in meaningful ways. The decision to sell Cartman Land back to its original owner for exactly the same amount he had paid for it demonstrated Eric's complete inability to recognize the value of what he had created or to negotiate from a position of strength. His willingness to accept $1 million for a property that was generating significant daily revenue and had appreciated substantially in value revealed both his impatience and his fundamental misunderstanding of basic business principles. The ease with which he surrendered his profitable enterprise showed that his primary motivation had never been financial success, but rather the immediate satisfaction of knowing he possessed something others wanted. The catastrophic loss of his entire inheritance to taxes and legal fees represented Eric's first major encounter with the reality that actions have consequences and that even wealthy individuals cannot operate outside the bounds of law and financial responsibility. The revelation that he owed substantial back taxes on his inheritance, combined with the lawsuit resulting from Kenny's death at his theme park, stripped away his $1 million fortune with shocking speed and efficiency. This financial devastation provided Eric with his first taste of how quickly circumstances could change and how vulnerable even the most powerful positions could prove to be. Kenny's death at Cartman Land, while tragically routine by South Park standards, carried particular significance because it occurred on Eric's property and under his direct supervision, making him legally liable for the wrongful death and exposing him to civil litigation that would consume the remainder of his inheritance. The casual nature of Kenny's demise, combined with Eric's dismissive attitude toward the death of his supposed friend, revealed the extent to which he had become desensitized to human suffering and tragedy. His reaction to being held financially responsible for Kenny's death showed complete lack of understanding about legal liability and moral responsibility. The legal proceedings that followed Kenny's death introduced Eric to the complex world of civil litigation, insurance claims, and wrongful death settlements, providing him with valuable education about how the legal system could be used both to protect and to destroy individual fortunes. His interactions with lawyers, insurance adjusters, and court officials taught him important lessons about how legal narratives could be constructed and how different interpretations of the same events could lead to vastly different outcomes. These experiences would prove invaluable in his later schemes involving corporate manipulation and religious fraud. The psychological impact of losing his entire inheritance within such a short period created a profound sense of betrayal and victimization that would influence Eric's worldview for years to come. Rather than recognizing his own poor decisions and lack of financial planning as the primary causes of his downfall, Eric interpreted his losses as evidence that the world was fundamentally unfair and that success was ultimately impossible to maintain without constant vigilance against those who would steal or destroy what he had built. This interpretation reinforced his existing paranoid tendencies and justified increasingly aggressive approaches to protecting his interests. The return to his mother's modest household, after experiencing the heights of millionaire status, created a psychological whiplash that intensified Eric's resentment toward his circumstances and his determination to regain the power and influence he had briefly possessed. The contrast between his recent life as a theme park owner and his current status as a dependent child living in subsidized housing reinforced his belief that conventional approaches to success were inadequate and that extraordinary measures would be necessary to achieve his goals. This experience planted the seeds for his later experiments with religious manipulation, political extremism, and corporate fraud. The lessons Eric learned from the Cartman Land experience would prove both valuable and dangerous in his future endeavors, as he retained his understanding of marketing psychology and artificial scarcity, while failing to develop any meaningful appreciation for financial responsibility or long-term planning. His success in creating desire through exclusion would inspire later schemes involving religious conversion and political movements, while his failure to maintain his fortune would drive him toward increasingly desperate and illegal methods of wealth accumulation. The brief taste of absolute power and unlimited resources had awakened appetites that his current circumstances could never satisfy through legitimate means. The psychological transformation that occurred during Eric's brief period as a millionaire theme park owner represented a crucial turning point in his development from ambitious schemer to genuinely dangerous criminal, as he learned that enormous power was possible to achieve, but discovered that maintaining such power required skills and discipline that he fundamentally lacked. This knowledge would drive him toward increasingly elaborate and risky schemes designed to recapture the sense of dominance and control that Cartman Land had provided, leading inevitably toward the religious and political manipulation that would define his adolescent years. The devastating financial collapse that followed Eric's brief reign as a millionaire theme park owner left him desperate to reclaim the wealth and power he had so carelessly squandered, driving him toward increasingly elaborate schemes that would exploit the deepest beliefs and values of those around him. His natural talent for manipulation, combined with his recent education in marketing psychology and artificial scarcity, led him to identify religious faith as the perfect vehicle for his next entrepreneurial venture. The Christian rock music industry presented an ideal opportunity to combine his musical ambitions with his newfound understanding of how to create artificial demand through exclusivity and moral positioning. The conception of Faith Plus One as Eric's vehicle for conquering the Christian music market demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of niche marketing and demographic targeting, even as it revealed his complete cynicism toward the religious beliefs he planned to exploit. His recognition that Christian rock fans represented an underserved market with strong purchasing power and deep emotional investment in their musical choices showed remarkable business insight for someone his age. However, his fundamental misunderstanding of the spiritual motivations that drove Christian music consumption would ultimately prove to be a fatal flaw in his otherwise well-conceived scheme. Eric's recruitment of Token and Butters as his bandmates revealed his intuitive grasp of how to leverage existing relationships and exploit others' talents for his own benefit, while simultaneously demonstrating his complete inability to recognize the value of genuine collaboration and shared artistic vision. Token's musical abilities provided the technical foundation that Eric's scheme required, while Butters' innocent demeanor offered the authentic spiritual presentation that Christian audiences would find credible. Eric positioned himself as the creative visionary and business mastermind, while relegating his bandmates to the role of hired musicians rather than equal partners. The systematic study of Christian rock music that Eric undertook in preparation for his scheme revealed both his remarkable capacity for research and analysis when properly motivated, and his complete inability to understand the difference between authentic spiritual expression and calculated market manipulation. His discovery that Christian rock songs followed predictable patterns and themes led him to develop a formulaic approach to songwriting that could produce commercially viable content without requiring any genuine religious conviction or spiritual insight. This mechanical approach to sacred music demonstrated his fundamental inability to comprehend the emotional and spiritual needs that Christian rock was designed to address. The recording sessions for Faith Plus One's debut album showcased Eric's emerging talents as a producer and director, as he orchestrated every aspect of the band's presentation to maximize their appeal to Christian audiences while minimizing the risk of exposure as fraudulent converts. His attention to visual imagery, lyrical content, and musical arrangement revealed a sophisticated understanding of how different elements could be combined to create a convincing artistic package. However, his obsessive focus on commercial success rather than artistic integrity created internal tensions that would eventually undermine the entire enterprise. The initial success of Faith Plus One in the Christian music marketplace exceeded even Eric's optimistic projections, as their debut album climbed the Christian rock charts with remarkable speed and generated substantial revenue from both digital downloads and physical sales. The enthusiastic reception from Christian radio stations and music retailers validated Eric's analysis of the market opportunity while providing him with his first taste of success in the entertainment industry. Concert bookings began pouring in from venues across the country, offering the prospect of substantial touring revenue and national recognition The sold-out arena concerts that followed Faith Plus One's commercial breakthrough provided Eric with the intoxicating experience of commanding the attention and adoration of thousands of devoted fans who viewed him as a spiritual leader and artistic inspiration. The psychological satisfaction of standing before massive crowds who hung on his every word and sang along to songs he had cynically manufactured specifically for their consumption fed directly into his narcissistic need for validation and control. These concert experiences taught him valuable lessons about crowd psychology and mass manipulation that would inform his later political and religious schemes. The platinum album certification that Eric coveted as the ultimate validation of his success remained tantalizingly out of reach due to the Christian music industry's unique approach to recognizing artistic achievement through gold, frankincense, and myrrh rather than traditional platinum awards. This seemingly minor difference in industry practices created a psychological crisis for Eric that exposed his fundamental inability to find satisfaction in genuine accomplishment when it failed to match his specific expectations. His obsession with obtaining a platinum plaque revealed that his motivations had never been truly artistic or spiritual, but rather focused on external validation and social status. The public meltdown that Eric experienced when confronted with the reality that Christian rock bands received different awards than secular artists demonstrated his complete inability to adapt his expectations to circumstances beyond his control. His explosive, profanity-laden outburst during what should have been a moment of triumph destroyed months of careful character construction and exposed him as a fraud to both his bandmates and his Christian audience. The incident revealed that beneath his carefully constructed religious persona lay the same angry, narcissistic child who had always struggled with disappointment and rejection. The aftermath of Eric's public exposure as a non-believer resulted in the immediate collapse of Faith Plus One's career and the loss of all the financial gains he had accumulated through his religious manipulation scheme. Concert cancellations, album returns, and the withdrawal of industry support stripped away his newfound wealth and status with the same devastating efficiency that had characterized his earlier financial collapse. The speed with which his Christian rock empire crumbled reinforced his growing belief that success was inherently temporary and that external forces would always conspire to destroy whatever he managed to build. The psychological impact of failing to achieve his desired platinum certification despite genuine commercial success created a profound sense of injustice and victimization that would fuel Eric's later experiments with political extremism and hate group formation. His inability to recognize that different industries operated according to different standards and conventions led him to interpret the Christian music industry's unique practices as a personal attack designed specifically to deny him the recognition he deserved. This paranoid interpretation of routine industry practices reinforced his existing tendency to view setbacks as evidence of systematic persecution rather than natural consequences of his own actions. The collapse of his Christian rock career coincided with Eric's exposure to Mel Gibson's controversial film, The Passion of the Christ, which provided him with a new model for combining religious imagery with political activism in pursuit of personal power and social influence. Gibson's ability to generate massive cultural controversy while maintaining a devoted following of supporters demonstrated to Eric that religious and political extremism could be powerful tools for commanding attention and building movements. The film's graphic violence and emotionally manipulative content appealed to Eric's growing fascination with psychological warfare and mass manipulation. The formation of Eric's Fourth Reich movement represented his first serious attempt to translate his entertainment industry experience into political organizing, as he applied lessons learned from managing Faith Plus One to the challenge of building a grassroots political movement. His recognition that political movements required the same careful attention to messaging, visual presentation, and audience targeting that had made his Christian rock band successful showed remarkable strategic thinking. However, his fundamental misunderstanding of political ideology and historical context would prove just as problematic as his earlier misunderstanding of religious faith. The recruitment tactics Eric employed to build his Fourth Reich following demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of how to identify and exploit social grievances and personal insecurities for political purposes. His ability to recognize which South Park residents harbored resentments that could be channeled into political action showed remarkable psychological insight, even as his choice to model his movement on historical fascism revealed his complete inability to understand the moral and practical problems inherent in such ideologies. The ease with which he assembled a devoted following of townspeople validated his belief in his own charismatic leadership abilities, while blinding him to the fundamental instability of movements built on hatred and resentment. The street demonstrations and rallies that Eric organized to showcase his political movement provided him with valuable experience in crowd control, public speaking, and media manipulation that would inform his later ventures into religious extremism and business fraud. His natural talent for delivering passionate speeches that could inspire ordinary citizens to abandon their normal reservations and embrace radical ideologies demonstrated abilities that could have been channeled toward positive social change under different circumstances. However, his complete lack of genuine political convictions or moral principles ensured that his movement would ultimately serve only his own psychological needs, rather than any coherent vision for social improvement. The arrival of Mel Gibson himself at one of Eric's political rallies created the perfect opportunity for the townspeople to witness firsthand the psychological instability and moral bankruptcy that lay beneath the surface of the movement they had joined. Gibson's erratic behavior and obvious mental disturbance served as a mirror that reflected the true nature of the ideology Eric had been promoting, forcing his followers to confront the reality that they had been manipulated into supporting something fundamentally destructive and insane. The mass exodus of supporters that followed Gibson's appearance left Eric once again isolated and powerless, having lost another carefully constructed empire through his inability to maintain control over the narrative and circumstances he had created. The devastating collapse of Eric's Fourth Reich movement left him more isolated and resentful than ever before, his grandiose political ambitions having crumbled in the face of public ridicule and mass defection by his former followers. The psychological wound inflicted by this latest failure ran deeper than his previous setbacks, because it had exposed not merely his incompetence as a leader, but his fundamental inability to understand the ideologies he attempted to exploit for personal gain. The humiliation of watching Mel Gibson's erratic behavior destroy his carefully constructed movement in a matter of minutes reinforced Eric's growing conviction that success was inherently temporary, and that external forces would always conspire to undermine his achievements. The transition from a failed political organizer to hate speech propagandist represented a natural evolution of Eric's manipulative strategies, as he recognized that targeting specific demographic groups for persecution could generate the kind of passionate response that political ideology alone had failed to inspire. His decision to focus on children with red hair, freckles, and pale skin as the subjects of his next campaign demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of how arbitrary physical characteristics could be weaponized to create artificial divisions within previously harmonious communities. The choice of redheads as his target population revealed both his tactical brilliance and his complete moral bankruptcy, as he selected a group that was distinctive enough to be easily identified, but small enough to be vulnerable to systematic persecution. The classroom presentation that launched Eric's anti-ginger campaign showcased his remarkable abilities as a public speaker and propaganda creator, as he delivered a meticulously researched and emotionally compelling argument for viewing red-headed individuals as fundamentally different from and inferior to the rest of humanity. His use of pseudo-scientific statistics, carefully selected historical examples, and inflammatory rhetoric demonstrated a level of sophistication in hate speech production that would have been impressive if it had not been so morally reprehensible. The presentation's effectiveness in convincing his classmates to embrace discriminatory attitudes toward their red-headed peers validated Eric's belief in his own persuasive powers, while revealing the disturbing ease with which ordinary children could be converted to extremist viewpoints. The immediate implementation of discriminatory policies against red-headed students throughout South Park Elementary provided Eric with tangible evidence of his ability to transform abstract ideological concepts into concrete social changes that affected real people's daily lives. The sight of red-headed children being forced to eat in hallways, excluded from normal classroom activities, and subjected to verbal harassment by their former friends, demonstrated the practical power of well-crafted hate speech to reshape social dynamics and institutional behaviors. This success fed Eric's growing sense of himself as someone capable of engineering large-scale social transformations through the strategic manipulation of fear, prejudice, and group psychology. The escalating persecution of red-headed students created exactly the kind of social division and conflict that Eric thrived upon as he positioned himself as the intellectual architect of a movement that was generating real consequences for identifiable victims. His role as the originator and chief theorist of anti-ginger ideology provided him with a sense of importance and influence that his previous failed ventures had been unable to deliver. The knowledge that his ideas were being implemented by others and affecting the lives of his classmates gave him an intoxicating taste of the kind of indirect power that would characterize his most successful future schemes. The intervention by Stan, Kyle, and Kenny represented a direct challenge to Eric's newfound influence and authority, as his closest associates recognized the dangerous trajectory of his hate speech campaign and attempted to derail it through direct action rather than reasoned argument. Their decision to dye his hair red while he slept demonstrated both their understanding of Eric's psychological vulnerabilities and their belief that personal experience might succeed where moral appeals had failed. The transformation of Eric from persecutor to potential victim created the perfect opportunity to test whether he possessed any capacity for empathy or self-reflection. When confronted with the consequences of his own ideological constructions, the moment of Eric's awakening to discover his red hair represented one of the most psychologically revealing episodes in his entire character development, as his immediate panic and horror at being classified as a member of the group he had targeted for persecution exposed the fundamental hypocrisy and self-serving nature of his ideological positions. Rather than recognizing the arbitrary and unjust nature of the discrimination he had promoted, Eric's first instinct was to seek protection and support from the same mother whose love he had previously taken for granted. The devastating rejection he experienced when his mother expressed disgust at his transformed appearance provided him with a brutal education in how quickly social acceptance could be withdrawn when physical characteristics changed. The psychological crisis that followed Eric's rejection by his mother and classification as a member of the persecuted group created the perfect conditions for what should have been a transformative moment of moral awakening and personal growth. Most individuals confronted with such direct experience of the injustice they had promoted would undergo significant self-reflection and behavioral change, developing empathy for their former victims and abandoning their discriminatory beliefs. However, Eric's response to this opportunity for moral development revealed the extent to which his personality had calcified around patterns of manipulation and self-interest that made genuine personal growth impossible. Rather than abandoning his anti-ginger ideology in the face of personal persecution, Eric doubled down on his extremist beliefs by inverting the hierarchy he had previously promoted and establishing himself as the leader of a ginger supremacist movement that sought to eliminate all non-redheaded individuals from South Park. This remarkable ideological flexibility demonstrated his complete lack of genuine conviction in any belief system beyond his own immediate self-interest, as he seamlessly transitioned from promoting persecution to leading the persecuted without experiencing any apparent cognitive dissonance or moral conflict about the contradiction. The formation of Eric's ginger supremacist organization showcased his remarkable ability to adapt his leadership and organizational skills to serve whatever ideology best suited his current circumstances regardless of how dramatically it contradicted his previous positions. His recruitment of other red-headed children as foot soldiers in his new extremist movement demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of how shared persecution could be leveraged to build group cohesion and loyalty. The speed with which he assembled a devoted following of ginger supremacists validated his belief in his own charismatic leadership abilities, while revealing his complete cynicism toward the ideological content of the movements he created. The strategic planning that went into Eric's ginger supremacist campaign revealed his growing sophistication as a terrorist organizer as he applied lessons learned from his previous failed movements to create a more effective and ruthless approach to achieving his goals. His decision to round up all non-red-headed individuals and confine them in a hotel demonstrated his willingness to employ kidnapping and imprisonment as tools of political control. The systematic nature of his roundup operation showed remarkable logistical planning abilities that could have been applied to legitimate organizational challenges if his motivations had been constructive rather than destructive. The mass imprisonment of South Park's non-red-headed population at the Denver Hilton Hotel represented the closest Eric had ever come to achieving the kind of absolute power and control that his narcissistic personality demanded. The sight of his former classmates, teachers, and community leaders, confined in cages and dependent on his mercy for their basic survival, provided him with the ultimate validation of his superiority and importance. The polite and deferential treatment he received from his prisoners, who were desperate to avoid provoking him into more extreme measures, fed his psychological need to be recognized as someone whose wishes and comfort were more important than the rights and freedoms of others. The final phase of Eric's ginger supremacist plan, which called for the systematic murder of all non-red-headed individuals in South Park, represented the logical conclusion of his extremist ideology and his complete abandonment of any moral constraints on his behavior. His willingness to commit genocide to maintain his newly acquired position of power revealed that there were no ethical boundaries he would not cross in pursuit of his psychological needs for dominance and control. The casual manner in which he discussed mass murder demonstrated his complete dehumanization of those who stood in the way of his goals. The intervention by Kyle that exposed Eric's true hair color and revealed the artificial nature of his ginger identity created the perfect opportunity for him to demonstrate his ultimate manipulative masterpiece as he faced a situation where any normal person would have been forced to admit defeat and accept consequences for their actions, rather than acknowledging the obvious contradiction between his supremacist ideology and his own non-ginger status. Eric deployed his most sophisticated manipulation technique by performing an elaborate musical number that simultaneously distracted his audience, confused the narrative, and allowed him to escape accountability without ever directly addressing the logical problems with his position. The song and dance routine that Eric used to escape from his genocidal plot represented the pinnacle of his abilities as a manipulator and performer, combining his entertainment industry experience with his political organizing skills to create a spectacle so engaging and confusing that his audience forgot to demand justice for his attempted crimes. his ability to transform a moment of certain defeat into an opportunity for theatrical triumph, demonstrated skills that transcended ordinary manipulation and entered the realm of genuine psychological artistry. The success of this escape strategy reinforced his belief that any situation could be overcome through sufficient creativity and audacity, no matter how impossible the circumstances might appear. The aftermath of Eric's ginger supremacist campaign left him more confident than ever in his ability to manipulate large groups of people and escape consequences for even the most serious crimes, while simultaneously revealing to his classmates and community the true extent of his psychological dangerousness and moral flexibility. His seamless transition between opposing extremist ideologies without experiencing any apparent internal conflict or personal growth demonstrated that he had evolved beyond ordinary sociopathy into something approaching pure instrumentalism, where all beliefs, relationships, and moral positions existed solely as tools to be deployed in service of his immediate psychological needs. The most bizarre chapter in Eric Cartman's twisted saga began not with malicious planning or calculated revenge, but with simple childhood impatience and his obsessive desire to obtain the Nintendo Wii gaming console on its release date. His inability to delay gratification or accept that some pleasures required waiting had always been a defining characteristic, but this particular instance of impatience would lead to consequences that transcended anything he had previously experienced. The Nintendo Wii represented more than just a gaming system to Eric. It symbolized the cutting edge of entertainment, technology, and social status, making its immediate acquisition a psychological necessity rather than a mere consumer preference. Eric's research into cryogenic preservation as a means of accelerating time revealed his remarkable ability to identify unconventional solutions to seemingly impossible problems, even when those solutions carried enormous risks and practical complications. His discovery that human beings could theoretically be frozen and then revived at future dates suggested a level of scientific curiosity and research capability that could have been channeled toward legitimate academic pursuits under different circumstances. However, his characteristic inability to consider long-term consequences or potential complications led him to embrace cryogenic freezing as a simple solution to his impatience problem without adequately investigating the technical requirements or success rates of such procedures. The implementation of Eric's self-freezing plan demonstrated both his remarkable determination to achieve his goals and his complete disregard for personal safety when those goals conflicted with conventional wisdom or established safety protocols. His willingness to entrust his life to improvised cryogenic equipment operated by amateurs revealed the extent to which his desire for immediate gratification could override basic survival. The casual manner in which he approached what was essentially a form of suicide gambling showed how thoroughly his narcissistic personality had distorted his understanding of risk and consequence. The awakening process that brought Eric back to consciousness in the year 2546 represented perhaps the most disorienting experience of his entire life, as he found himself thrust into a world that had evolved far beyond anything he could have imagined during his original time period. The technological advances that surrounded him provided immediate evidence that his cryogenic gamble had succeeded in its basic objective of accelerating his personal timeline, but the social and cultural changes that had occurred during his absence created challenges that no amount of technological sophistication could easily resolve. His initial confusion and disbelief at finding himself in such a radically different world demonstrated a rare moment of genuine vulnerability and uncertainty. The discovery that the society of 2546 had completely abandoned religious belief in favor of universal atheism represented a fundamental shock to Eric's understanding of human nature and social organization, as his previous manipulative schemes had relied heavily on exploiting people's spiritual beliefs and religious commitments. The absence of religious faith as a tool for manipulation forced him to rapidly adapt his strategic thinking to a social environment where traditional appeals to divine authority or spiritual fear would be completely ineffective. This adaptation required him to develop new approaches to influence and control that were based purely on secular considerations and rational arguments. The atheist society's division into competing factions engaged in violent conflict over minor theological differences within their shared non-belief system provided Eric with an unexpected opportunity to apply his organizational and leadership skills in a context where his lack of genuine religious conviction would actually be an advantage rather than a liability. His ability to understand and exploit the psychological dynamics driving sectarian conflict transcended the specific content of the ideological disputes, allowing him to quickly identify opportunities for advancement within the warring atheist organizations. Eric's recruitment by the Unified Atheist League and his rapid integration into their military structure demonstrated his remarkable adaptability and his ability to present himself as a valuable asset to organizations whose goals he understood only superficially. His willingness to embrace atheist ideology with the same cynical opportunism he had previously applied to Christianity and political extremism showed that his core personality had remained unchanged despite the centuries-long gap. His experience, the ease with which he assumed a position of trust within the atheist military, revealed both his natural charismatic abilities and the organization's desperate need for competent personnel. The strategic betrayal of the Sea Otters that Eric orchestrated during his service with the Unified Atheist League showcased his ability to function effectively as a double agent while maintaining the trust and confidence of multiple competing organizations simultaneously. His success in gaining access to sensitive sea otter intelligence while appearing to be a loyal atheist soldier demonstrated sophisticated skills in deception and compartmentalization that exceeded even his previous achievements in manipulation. The information crystal he obtained through this betrayal provided him with valuable leverage that could be used to advance his position within the atheist power structure. The battlefield promotion and recognition Eric received for his intelligence coup validated his belief in his own tactical brilliance, while providing him with the social status and military authority he had always craved. His ability to succeed within the atheist military hierarchy without possessing any genuine commitment to their cause or understanding of their long-term objectives proved that his manipulative skills could function effectively in any social context, regardless of the specific ideological content involved. This success reinforced his confidence in his ability to infiltrate and exploit any organization for personal benefit. The Nintendo Wii console that Eric finally obtained in the year 2546 represented both the achievement of his original goal and a profound symbol of the futility of his entire temporal displacement adventure, as the gaming system he had sacrificed centuries to obtain immediately had become an obsolete antique with no practical value in his new time period. The irony of successfully acquiring something that no longer mattered demonstrated the fundamental flaw in his approach to problem solving, which consistently prioritized immediate desires over long-term planning and rational consideration of consequences. The discovery of temporal communication technology through future advertising provided Eric with an unexpected opportunity to influence his own past and potentially prevent the chain of events that had led to his displacement, revealing capabilities that transcended simple manipulation into the realm of genuine temporal paradox creation. His decision to contact his past self represented a rare moment of constructive thinking, as he attempted to use his hard-won knowledge to prevent future suffering, rather than simply advancing his immediate interests. However, his characteristic inability to communicate effectively or provide clear guidance limited the practical value of his temporal intervention. The break-in at the teenager's house to steal temporal communication equipment demonstrated that Eric's criminal inclinations had not been diminished by his experience with future society, as he remained willing to commit theft and property violation when conventional approaches to achieving his goals proved insufficient. His casual attitude toward criminal behavior in an advanced technological society showed remarkable psychological consistency across temporal boundaries. The success of his theft validated his belief that determination and creativity could overcome any obstacle, regardless of the legal or ethical implications. The phone call to his past self represented Eric's most direct attempt to exercise temporal influence and prevent his own suffering, though his characteristic inability to provide clear instructions or helpful guidance limited the effectiveness of his intervention. His frustrated communication with his younger self revealed the psychological distance that had developed between his current sophisticated understanding and his previous naive impulsiveness. The failure to successfully prevent his own temporal displacement demonstrated the fundamental limitations of his ability to influence events, even when armed with perfect knowledge of future consequences. The resolution of the atheist factional conflicts through Eric's indirect influence represented perhaps the most genuinely positive outcome he had ever achieved. as his presence and actions contributed to reducing violence and promoting cooperation between previously warring groups. The unification of the atheist factions under a banner of mutual respect and shared purpose created lasting social benefits that extended far beyond Eric's personal interests or immediate goals. This accidental heroism demonstrated that his tactical abilities and leadership skills could produce positive outcomes when channeled through circumstances that aligned his selfish motivations with broader social benefits. The farewell ceremony that marked Eric's departure from the future timeline provided him with a rare experience of genuine gratitude and recognition from people whose lives he had genuinely improved, creating a form of validation that transcended his usual narcissistic need for attention and control. The acknowledgement of his positive contributions to future society offered a glimpse of what his life might have been like if his abilities had been consistently applied to constructive rather than destructive purposes. However, his return to his original time period would quickly demonstrate that this brief experience of heroism had not fundamentally altered his core personality or moral orientation. The temporal displacement adventure that Eric experienced represented both his greatest success and his most profound failure, as he achieved recognition as a genuine hero, while simultaneously demonstrating his complete inability to learn from experience or apply positive lessons to his future behavior. The knowledge that he possessed the capacity for heroic action under appropriate circumstances would remain largely theoretical, as his return to familiar social environments would quickly reactivate the destructive patterns of manipulation and exploitation that had defined his previous development. The revelation that would ultimately destroy Eric Cartman's sense of identity and shatter his understanding of his own past came not through gradual discovery, but through the calculated revenge of Scott de Norman, whose patient planning over nearly a decade had created the perfect trap for the boy who had murdered and fed him his own parents. The ban on discussing this particular episode in polite society only added to the psychological weight of what transpired, as the events were so disturbing that even South Park's normally permissive standards for public discourse could not accommodate open discussion of the horrors that unfolded. Scott's methodical approach to revenge demonstrated a level of strategic thinking and emotional discipline that far exceeded anything Eric had previously encountered, revealing that his victim had used the intervening years to develop into a formidable adversary. The kidnapping operation that brought Eric face to face with his past required careful coordination between Scott and the ginger supremacist movement that Eric had previously manipulated for his own purposes, creating a poetic justice where his former victims became the instruments of his downfall. The involvement of the red-headed children, whom Eric had alternately persecuted and claimed to lead, demonstrated Scott's sophisticated understanding of how to turn Eric's own manipulative tactics against him. The selection of a chilly carnival as the venue for this confrontation carried obvious symbolic significance, deliberately echoing the setting where Eric had achieved his greatest triumph through the most heinous means possible. The binding of Eric's loved ones and forcing them to witness his humiliation represented a calculated psychological assault designed to maximize his suffering by ensuring that his moment of ultimate defeat would be observed by everyone whose opinion mattered to him. Scott's understanding that Eric's narcissistic personality required an audience for both his triumphs and his failures showed remarkable insight into the psychological mechanisms that drove his former tormentor. The presence of witnesses transformed what could have been a private moment of revelation into a public spectacle that would permanently alter how Eric's family and friends viewed both him and themselves. The revelation that Scott Tenorman was Eric's half-brother, delivered through carefully researched genealogical evidence, created an immediate psychological crisis that transcended simple shock and entered the realm of existential horror. The documentation that proved Jack Tenorman, a Denver Broncos player, had been Eric's biological father, provided the missing piece of the paternity puzzle that had haunted Eric throughout his childhood. However, this long-sought answer came with the devastating realization that Eric's greatest triumph had actually been the murder of his own father, transforming his proudest achievement into his most horrific crime. The psychological impact of learning that he had killed, butchered, and fed his own father to his half-brother created a form of trauma that exceeded anything in Eric's previous experience, as it forced him to confront the reality that his most celebrated act of revenge had actually been an act of patricide and cannibalism of the most intimate kind. The knowledge that he had consumed his own father's flesh as part of the chili that celebrated Scott's suffering added layers of horror that his mind struggled to process. This revelation destroyed not only his sense of personal identity, but his entire understanding of his relationship to his family and his place in the world. The immediate aftermath of Scott's revelation triggered a complete psychological breakdown that manifested in Eric's inability to maintain his normal patterns of manipulation and control, as the fundamental assumptions underlying his worldview had been shattered beyond repair. His previous confidence in his own moral superiority and intellectual supremacy crumbled in the face of evidence that his greatest success had been built upon the most profound ignorance and self-deception. The realization that Scott had possessed crucial information about Eric's identity for years, while Eric remained oblivious, demonstrated a reversal of their intellectual relationship that was almost as devastating as the family revelation itself. The return to South Park Elementary following this traumatic revelation marked the beginning of Eric's descent into complete psychological fragmentation, as he proved unable to maintain his previous social relationships or academic performance in the face of his shattered self-image. His classmates' casual references to his weight, which had previously triggered only his familiar angry responses, now provoked reactions that suggested much deeper psychological disturbance. The normal social dynamics of elementary school became unbearable for someone whose entire sense of self had been built upon false assumptions about his family history and personal achievements. The emergence of Eric's conversations with his stuffed animals represented a desperate attempt to find sources of emotional support and validation that were not contaminated by the horrible knowledge he now carried about his own nature and history. His dolls and stuffed toys became the only companions who could provide unconditional acceptance without judging him for his past actions or questioning his version of events. These one-sided conversations revealed the extent to which his capacity for normal human relationships had been damaged by the revelation of his inadvertent patricide and the psychological trauma that followed. The systematic torture and murder of his stuffed animals that Eric began conducting in the privacy of his bedroom represented the external manifestation of the internal psychological violence he was experiencing as his mind struggled to process the implications of Scott's revelation. His treatment of his toys as both beloved companions and objects of torture reflected the conflicted emotions he felt toward himself and his past actions. The elaborate torture devices he constructed demonstrated that his capacity for detailed planning and mechanical innovation remained intact, even as his emotional stability deteriorated. The burning of his own house represented perhaps the most dramatic expression of Eric's psychological disintegration, as he destroyed the physical space that had sheltered his childhood in an attempt to eliminate the environmental reminders of his false identity and fabricated family narrative. The arson was both a cry for help and an act of self-punishment, as he sought to create external circumstances that matched his internal sense of devastation and loss. The investigation that followed provided him with another opportunity to manipulate authority figures and construct alternative narratives. Though his heart was no longer fully committed to these deceptions, the torture chamber that Eric constructed in his basement for the systematic elimination of his stuffed animals revealed the extent to which his understanding of interpersonal relationships had become warped by trauma and psychological fragmentation. His ability to derive emotional satisfaction from the destruction of objects that had previously provided comfort suggested that his capacity for love and attachment had been fundamentally damaged by the knowledge of what he had done to his own family. The elaborate nature of these torture scenarios demonstrated that his intelligence and creativity remained functional even as his emotional life collapsed. The final confrontation between Eric and his doll, Polly Priss Pants, which culminated in the explosive destruction of his remaining stuffed animals, represented the symbolic elimination of his last sources of emotional support and his complete acceptance of isolation as his natural state. His decision to destroy even his most beloved toy in order to satisfy the imaginary demands of another toy revealed the extent to which his relationship with reality had become compromised. The wedding ceremony he conducted between himself and the surviving doll suggested that his capacity for genuine human connection had been replaced by elaborate fantasy relationships that existed entirely within his own damaged psyche. The aftermath of Eric's psychological breakdown left him more isolated and emotionally damaged than at any previous point in his development, as the revelation of his inadvertent patricide had destroyed not only his sense of personal achievement, but his fundamental understanding of his own nature and capabilities. His previous confidence in his ability to manipulate and control others had been replaced by a profound sense of powerlessness and victimization that would influence all his future relationships and endeavors. The knowledge that his greatest triumph had actually been his most horrific failure created a psychological wound that would never fully heal. The long-term consequences of Scott's revenge extended far beyond the immediate psychological trauma to fundamentally alter Eric's approach to planning and risk assessment, as he could no longer trust his own understanding of situations or his ability to predict consequences. His previous willingness to take enormous risks in pursuit of ambitious goals was tempered by the knowledge that incomplete information could transform apparent victories into devastating defeats. This newfound caution would limit his future criminal enterprises, while simultaneously making him more dangerous due to his increased paranoia and suspicion of others' motives. The irony of Eric's situation was that Scott's revenge had succeeded so completely that it eliminated any possibility of Eric achieving the kind of psychological growth or moral development that might have led to genuine redemption. As the trauma of learning about his patricide had damaged his capacity for self-reflection and emotional growth, rather than inspiring him to examine his past behavior and make amends for his crimes, the revelation drove him deeper into psychological isolation and defensive justification of his actions. The opportunity for moral awakening that the truth might have provided was lost in the overwhelming horror of its specific content and timing. The episode that documented these events would later be banned from public discussion, not only because of its disturbing content, but because it demonstrated the futility of revenge as a tool for justice or moral education, showing how even perfectly executed vengeance could create new forms of suffering without resolving the original injustices that motivated it. Scott's success in destroying Eric's peace of mind came at the cost of his own moral integrity, as his elaborate revenge plot required him to become nearly as manipulative and cruel as his original tormentor. The cycle of trauma and retaliation that emerged from their conflict would continue to influence both their lives for years to come, proving that some wounds create more wounds rather than healing. The most extraordinary chapter in Eric Cartman's tumultuous life began decades after his childhood traumas, when he had somehow managed to transform himself into Rabbi Eric Cartman, the respected spiritual leader of Bet Knesset Synagogue in Colorado Springs. This remarkable metamorphosis represented perhaps the most unlikely character development in South Park's entire history. As the boy who had once championed Nazi ideology and promoted genocidal hatred against various minority groups, had apparently embraced Judaism with such dedication and authenticity that he had risen to become a prominent religious leader within the Jewish community. The physical transformation that accompanied Eric's spiritual journey was equally dramatic, as the obese and slovenly child had evolved into a dignified middle-aged man whose appearance radiated the kind of quiet authority and intellectual depth typically associated with serious religious scholarship. His traditional Orthodox attire, complete with prayer, shawl, and yarmulke, created a visual presentation that seemed to embody genuine spiritual commitment rather than the superficial costume changes that had characterized his previous attempts at religious manipulation. The careful grooming and respectful demeanor he displayed suggested that his conversion to Judaism had involved not merely theological study, but a complete reconstruction of his personal habits and social presentation. The family that Eric had built around his newfound faith represented the ultimate validation of his apparent transformation, as his wife and 3 children embodied the kind of loving domestic stability that had been completely absent from his own childhood experience. His marriage appeared to be based on genuine mutual respect and shared spiritual values, rather than the manipulation and exploitation that had characterized all his previous relationships. The presence of children who clearly adored and respected their father suggested that Eric had somehow developed the capacity for nurturing and protection that had been entirely missing from his psychological makeup during his youth. The synagogue community that had embraced Eric as their spiritual leader provided compelling evidence that his conversion represented authentic change rather than another elaborate deception, as these individuals had entrusted him with their most sacred responsibilities and personal spiritual guidance. His reputation within the broader Jewish community of Colorado Springs indicated that his religious knowledge and pastoral skills had been tested and validated through years of genuine service and dedication. The respect he commanded from his congregants suggested that he had successfully transcended his past and built a new identity based on legitimate spiritual growth and community service. The reunion with Kyle Broflovsky that threatened to unravel Eric's carefully constructed new life came at a moment when his happiness and stability seemed most secure, creating the perfect conditions for maximum psychological impact when his past inevitably collided with his present. Kyle's immediate suspicion and hostility toward Eric's transformation reflected not only their shared history of conflict, but Kyle's understandable inability to believe that someone capable of such profound evil could achieve genuine redemption. The intensity of Kyle's disbelief served as a mirror that reflected the truly extraordinary nature of Eric's apparent change, highlighting just how impossible such a transformation would seem to anyone who had witnessed his previous behavior. The confrontation between Eric and Kyle in front of Eric's family created a devastating collision between past and present that threatened to destroy everything Eric had built through decades of genuine effort and spiritual growth. Kyle's aggressive challenges to Eric's authenticity forced him to defend not only his own transformation, but the legitimacy of his family's faith and identity in front of his confused and frightened children. The public nature of this confrontation turned what should have been a private reckoning with the past into a traumatic family crisis that exposed Eric's children to knowledge about their father's history that no child should have to process. The discovery that Eric's transformation was apparently genuine rather than another elaborate deception created a profound moral dilemma for Kyle and the other boys, as they were forced to confront the possibility that people could change in fundamental ways and that past sins might be overcome through authentic repentance and spiritual growth. Kyle's inability to accept Eric's redemption reflected his own psychological investment in maintaining Eric as a symbol of irredeemable evil, a role that had provided Kyle with a clear moral framework and sense of righteous purpose throughout their shared childhood. The prospect that Eric had genuinely changed threatened to undermine Kyle's entire understanding of justice, morality, and the nature of human character. The revelation of the boys' dissatisfaction with their own adult lives provided the crucial context for understanding why they would be willing to destroy Eric's happiness in order to change their own circumstances, as their decision to alter the timeline stemmed not from any principled objection to Eric's redemption, but from their own selfish desire to escape the consequences of their own choices and failures. Stan's failed marriage, Kyle's professional disappointments, and Kenny's continued poverty created a collective sense of regret that made them willing to sacrifice Eric's family for the possibility of improving their own situations. This decision revealed that despite their moral posturing, they remained fundamentally selfish individuals who prioritized their own interests over justice or compassion. The time travel plan that the boys developed to alter their shared past represented the ultimate expression of their inability to accept responsibility for their own choices and their willingness to destroy others' happiness in pursuit of their own satisfaction. Their belief that changing specific historical events would automatically improve their current circumstances demonstrated a naive understanding of causality and consequence that ignored the complex web of factors that had shaped their adult lives. The casual manner in which they dismissed the impact their plan would have on Eric's family revealed a callousness that rivaled Eric's own childhood cruelty. Eric's desperate attempt to protect his family by forming an anti-time travel alliance showed that his transformation had indeed been genuine, as he demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice his own interests and even his own life to preserve the people he loved. His recruitment of the psychotic Butters to delay the boys' time travel efforts through NFT scams revealed that he retained his strategic thinking abilities and understanding of human psychology, but now applied these skills in service of protecting rather than exploiting others. The irony that he was forced to use manipulation and deception to defend his family against his former victims highlighted the tragic complexity of his situation. The failure of Eric's defensive efforts and the successful implementation of the boys' time travel plan resulted in the complete erasure of his family and his return to the homeless, isolated existence that had characterized his youth, creating a form of punishment that exceeded any legal sentence or moral retribution that could have been imposed through conventional means. The loss of his wife and children represented not merely the destruction of his current happiness, but the elimination of any evidence that his transformation had ever occurred, leaving him with only his own memories of the love and purpose he had briefly experienced. The psychological impact of losing his family while retaining full memory of their existence created a unique form of torture that combined the grief of bereavement with the frustration of being unable to convince anyone that the lost relationships had ever existed. Eric's attempts to describe his erased family to others were met with skepticism and confusion, as the timeline changes had eliminated all evidence of their existence while leaving him as the sole witness to their reality. This isolation in his grief added psychological torment to the practical devastation of losing everything he had built through decades of genuine effort. The return to homelessness and social isolation that marked Eric's final fate represented the ultimate triumph of his childhood victims over his adult redemption, as they had successfully destroyed not only his current happiness, but his entire capacity to build meaningful relationships or contribute positively to society. The knowledge that he had once achieved genuine love and spiritual fulfillment made his current circumstances even more painful, as he could no longer find comfort in believing that happiness was impossible for someone with his history. The contrast between his brief experience of redemption and his final state of abandonment created a form of suffering that exceeded anything he had experienced during his traumatic childhood. The philosophical questions raised by Eric's ultimate fate centered on whether society had an obligation to allow genuine redemption to succeed, or whether some crimes created permanent debts that could never be fully repaid regardless of subsequent behavior. His former victims' decision to prioritize their own happiness over his family's existence suggested that forgiveness and redemption were luxuries that society could withdraw when convenient, rather than fundamental principles that should be honored even when difficult. The destruction of his family raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and whether past victims had the right to continue punishing reformed perpetrators indefinitely. The tragic irony of Eric's story was that his most genuine achievement and his most complete happiness had been destroyed not by external authorities seeking justice, but by the very people whose suffering had originally motivated his transformation, creating a cycle of retribution that ensured suffering would continue across generations, rather than healing through forgiveness and acceptance. His former victims had become perpetrators themselves, using their knowledge of time travel to inflict suffering that exceeded what they had originally endured. The moral complexity of this reversal highlighted the difficulty of distinguishing between justice and revenge when both involve the deliberate infliction of suffering. The final image of Eric Cartman as a homeless wanderer, carrying only the memories of a family that no longer existed and a redemption that had been erased from history, represented perhaps the most tragic conclusion possible for a character whose journey had encompassed the full spectrum of human moral possibility. His transformation from monster to saint to victim demonstrated the complex and often contradictory nature of human character development, while his ultimate fate served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of refusing to accept that people can change and that redemption, once achieved, deserves protection rather than destruction. The complete story of Eric Cartman serves as perhaps the most complex examination of human nature ever chronicled in South Park's chaotic universe, revealing how childhood trauma, environmental neglect, and psychological damage can create monsters, while simultaneously demonstrating that even the most corrupted souls retain the capacity for genuine transformation and redemption. His journey from innocent kindergartner to calculating psychopath to spiritual leader to tragic victim encompasses the full spectrum of moral possibility, challenging conventional understanding of justice, forgiveness, and the nature of personal change. The cyclical nature of Eric's suffering reveals the devastating truth that trauma perpetuates itself across generations and relationships, as each act of cruelty he committed stemmed from wounds inflicted by others, while each revenge taken against him created new victims who would eventually seek their own retribution. His brief period of genuine happiness and spiritual fulfillment proved that redemption was possible even for someone who had committed the most heinous crimes. Yet, the destruction of that redemption by his former victims demonstrated society's fundamental inability to accept that people can truly change. Eric's ultimate fate raises profound questions about whether justice requires permanent punishment or whether mercy demands accepting authentic transformation regardless of past sins. His story suggests that the refusal to forgive may create more suffering than the original crimes, trapping everyone involved in endless cycles of retribution that prevent healing and growth. In the end, Eric Cartman's life stands as both cautionary tale and tragic reminder that everyone deserves the possibility of redemption, even when that possibility seems impossible to believe.